In this course, we've been exploring three main approaches to understanding the human person. The psychological approach, according to which we are essentially self-conscious beings and persist over time by means of some kind of psychological continuity. The biological approach, according to which we are human organisms and we persist over time by means of the continuity of something like your metabolic functions. And we looked at the third approach called the further fact approach. According to which neither psychological continuity nor biological continuity are enough to make you the same over time. The most common variety of the further fact approach is soul theory, according to which it says that the reason why neither psychological continuity nor biological continuity are enough to explain your identity over time is that there is some further part that you possess, some immaterial part that we can call a soul. And so we saw under each of the three main approaches that there are various subdivisions. There are various varieties of these different approaches. Under the psychological approach, we saw Locke's memory account, in which he places all of the continuity of your identity in terms of what you remember. You exist as long as you can remember, and you exist as far back as you can remember. We also saw the bundle theory, championed by Hume and some contemporary philosophers, according to which you are a bundle of mental states, and what makes you the same over time is not the possession of any particular mental state, but enough continuity in the bundle over time. And we also saw Jeff McMahon's thinking parts view, according to which you are the smallest part of your brain that can support conscious thought, and you persist as long as that part continues to maintain its functionality. Under the biological approach, we saw animalism, which places your identity in terms of biological continuity, in terms of the continuity of your life, your metabolic processes, versus maybe a slightly different version of that view called the bodily continuity theory, according to which you persist as the body that you are, living or dead. And so it's more about the continuity of the lump of flesh rather than the continuity of any life processes. And under soul theory, which is under the larger category of further fact theories, we saw a version of soul theory called substance dualism, which takes the body and the soul to be distinct substances temporarily related to one another. And then we saw hylomorphism, the view according to which the soul and the body are related to each other as form to matter, and you are the one single substance composed of both parts. We've been exploring the different varieties of these three main approaches. We've been looking at various authors in the history of philosophy and in contemporary philosophy who hold each one. We've been looking at the major arguments for and against these different views and the different variations of the views. In these last couple of weeks, what I'd like to explore are some various applied issues, that show just how important it is to get this right. And so I'm going to look at three sets of applied issues, ways in which we can see that it makes a difference which account we hold. I want to look at three sorts of issues. I want to look at issues at the beginning of life, I want to look at issues at the end of life, and I want to look at the issue of the afterlife. Now, keeping in mind all the details we know about the different views and all the various pros and cons we have gone over for each of the views, what I'd like to do in these next several weeks is I'd like to consider the implications of all the views that we've considered, and along the way we might get a few new variants of those views. I want to see their various implications for issues at the beginning of life, at the end of life, and with respect to the afterlife. So the question that is going to organize our study when we approach issues at the beginning of life is, on the various theories of personal identity that we've explored in this class, when do we begin to exist? So the question is, on each view, when can you say that that was the first moment of my existence? And different views of the human person are going to have different answers to this question. We'll see some overlap between some of the views, but there will be a lot of differences in how they answer this question. Now, who cares? Why does this matter? Well, along the way, I'll also explore various ethical issues that I think could be tied up into this question about when we begin to exist. So we'll explore the issue of abortion, how different theories of the human person can approach the issue of abortion. Along the way, we'll also talk about embryonic stem cell research, perhaps some forms of contraception, in vitro fertilization, embryo adoption. At the end of life, the main question is, when do we die? When can we say that a person has died and is there no more? Different views of the human person, once again, will have different answers to this question. And the relevant ethical issues here have to do with the ethics of euthanasia and advance directives and organ transplantation. The last applied issue that I'd like to explore is the one concerning the afterlife. Our operating question here is whether it is even possible for us to survive our deaths, and if so, how might this work? You might think that philosophy can't show us that indeed we do survive our deaths, but the question I want to consider is on each of the theories of the human person, would it even make sense? Is it even coherent to say that you could survive your death? And some of you know, and some maybe so, but we have to look at how the approach might even explain or give a model for how it could even occur that you could survive your death. So I want to start the beginning of life issues by looking at something I'd like to call the identity-based argument for the moral impermissibility of abortion. So I want to start by looking at an argument that someone might give for thinking that abortion is off limits. I think this will set the debate. I think it will set the discussion for where we go. So the identity-based argument for the moral impermissibility of abortion starts with the premise that at any moment of my existence, it would be morally wrong for someone to end my life. So the general claim is that I am something of full moral value, and I have full moral value at every stage of my existence. Premise 2 says that I was indeed once a fetus. Premise 3 says that abortion ends the life of a fetus. Premise 4 says, hence it would have been morally wrong for someone to abort the fetus that I once was. If I am if I have full moral status at every stage of my existence, and I was once a fetus, that means I had full moral status at that stage, and so it would have been morally wrong to end my life at that stage. Premise 5 says that other fetuses that now exist or will exist are the same substantial or essential kind of thing that I was. They are no different in kind than what I am today. And the conclusion is, therefore, it would be morally wrong for someone to abort any of those fetuses. Now, I think maybe the two key premises in this argument are premise 1 and premise 2. What I think this argument nicely focuses for us is that the morality of abortion really comes down to two sorts of issues. There is usually in any argument against the morality of abortion something like a moral status premise and something like a metaphysics or identity premise. So the moral status premise is premise 1. It's the one that says that you, whatever you are, essentially, is something that is morally valuable and at every point at which it exists. We've seen already that Eric Olson seems willing to abandon that premise. Premise 2 was the identity or the metaphysical premise. It states that you were once a fetus. And so I think actually, in order to successfully argue that abortion is immoral, you'd have to argue two sorts of things. One, you'd have to argue that you were once the sort of thing, or the sort of thing in question is the same sort of thing as what you are. I think that an opponent of abortion would also have to establish that not only, right, is it the same kind of thing as us in the womb, but that it also has the same moral value as us. And so you'd have to establish both that the thing in the womb is the same kind of thing as us, and also that not only is it the same kind of thing as us, but it also has the same moral value that we do. And indeed, what this also shows that anyone who wants to show that abortion could be morally permissible has two strategies for doing so. He or she could argue that that which is in the womb is not even the same sort of thing that we are. Or the person could admit that it is the same kind of thing that we are, but it's at a stage of development, or it doesn't have the right sort of capacities at that stage to make it have the same moral value as us. Now, there's all sorts of good literature on the moral status question, about what sorts of things is it wrong to kill, and why is the category to which we belong something that it is wrong to kill. But I want to focus on this course, as we have throughout, on the metaphysical question, on the identity question, whether that which is in the womb is the same kind of thing as you are. As we'll see, there are various theories of the human person that will deny that premise, which I think is an essential premise for something like an argument for the impermissibility of abortion. Because if it's not the same sort of thing as us, I think that it's going to be really difficult to establish that it has the same sort of moral value that we do. So I think that a really crucial premise in the argument is establishing that it is the same essential kind of thing that we are. But as I said, very many ethical theories will actually deny this. They will say that you were never a fetus, and so whatever's in the womb there is not the same sort of thing as you. And so any claims you want to make about your moral value do not extend to that thing that is in the womb. So as a representative of someone who argues for the permissibility of abortion based on the falsity of the metaphysical, on the identity premise, is Lynne Rudder Baker. And so I had you read an article by her in which she articulates this sort of strategy for arguing for the permissibility of abortion. So I want to take you through that article to show you how she is reaching that conclusion and how she defends the various moves she makes along the way. So here's the general structure of the Lynne Baker article. First, she establishes what she takes a human person to be, and here she's understanding this to just be what sort of thing you and I are. And then second, she wants to establish when we begin to exist on that account. So first she establishes, here's my theory about what a human person is, what we are, and on this theory, here's when you begin to exist. And then the third step in her article is to defend her theory of what a human person is against three main rivals. Here she considers substance dualism, standard animalism, and a view she calls Thomistic animalism, or we can just call hylomorphism. And then finally, in the fourth step, in the fourth stage of her article, she applies her answer to when we begin to exist, based on her theory of the human person, to the issue of abortion. So the way that she's arguing here, right, the way that she's setting up the argument, she first wants to establish what sort of thing we are, and not only spell out exactly how that view works, but why it's a better view than the other views on offer. And then she wants to establish when we begin to exist on that account, which has been shown, she thinks, to be the best account of what we are. And so based on that account, as it's going to turn out, that we don't begin to exist until sometime at least very late in pregnancy, if not at birth or after birth, then any abortions that occur before that wouldn't be killing the same sort of thing that we are, and so not obviously immoral. So that's the general structure of her article. One more time, she wants to give her account of the human person. She wants to explain when we begin to exist on that account. She wants to defend that general account of what we are against some of the main competitors. And then she wants to explore what sort of implications her view of the human person and when it says that we begin to exist to the ethics of abortion. So that's what we'll go through in this video. I want to explore how Lynne Rudder Baker applies her view to the issue of abortion. So let's first run through her account of what a human person is. First, she establishes a general definition of what a person in general is. There might be non-human persons, but here's what makes something a person, according to Lynne Rudder Baker. A person is a being with a first-person perspective. So if something doesn't have a first-person perspective, then it's not a person. Now, what does she mean by first-person perspective? That's something we need to explore in order to get the details about. Now, if that's what makes something a person, is a being with a first-person perspective, what makes something a human person? What sort of persons are we? Well, according to her view, a human person is a being with a first-person perspective, so we are persons, but what makes us human is that we are constituted by a human animal. She wants to say that we are not identical to the human animals sitting in our chairs, but that we bear some other relationship to them. In other words, we are constituted by human animals. So there are two parts to her definition of what a human person is then, is that we are beings with first-person perspectives, but that we are beings with first-person perspectives that are constituted by human animals. That's what makes us not only persons, but human persons. And so there are two parts that we need to get clear about in order to fully understand her account. First, we need to understand well, what does it mean to have a first-person perspective, and what kind of first-person perspective do we have, and what sort of first-person perspective is required for something to be a person? And then secondly, we need to get a better sense of this constitution relation, how she's really understanding us as being related to the animal, and how that's different from some of the other views that we have considered. So let's go into the stuff about the first-person perspective. Here she wants to distinguish between what she calls a rudimentary first-person perspective and a robust first-person perspective. In order to count as having a rudimentary first-person perspective, you have to meet three conditions. The first condition is that you have to be conscious or sentient. She doesn't spell this out in a whole lot of detail, but I think the general idea is that you have to have some sort of conscious experience, sentience. Maybe it's the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, that sort of thing. She thinks also the second condition is that the being has to have a capacity to imitate. And third, she thinks that in order to have a rudimentary first-person perspective, the behavior of such creature must be explainable only by means of attribution of beliefs, desires, and intentions. In other words, the only way to explain what it's doing is to attribute to that thing various beliefs, desires, and intentions. So once again, a rudimentary first-person perspective requires that the thing be conscious or sentient, that it have the capacity to imitate, and that its behavior be explainable only by means of an attribution of beliefs, desires, and intentions. Now that's a rudimentary first-person perspective. What's a robust first-person perspective? A robust first-person perspective is when you meet all three of those conditions, but then you also meet a fourth condition. The fourth condition is that in addition to having all those things, you also have the ability to use and understand first-person pronouns. You're able to reflect on your experience as your own, and you're able to refer to yourself through some sort of language. She thinks that once you have that additional element, once you meet that further condition, now you not only have a rudimentary first-person perspective, but a robust first-person perspective. Okay, so that's the difference between rudimentary and robust. What kind of first-person perspective is she talking about when she says that a person is a being with a first-person perspective? Here's the way she establishes this. She says that a person is a being that has a rudimentary first-person perspective. So in order to be a person, you have to have a rudimentary first-person perspective, but you also have to meet another condition, is that you have to be a member of a kind that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. So you have to have a rudimentary first-person perspective right now, and you have to be the kind of thing that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. Now remember the difference. The difference is about language use, about the ability to use first-person pronouns, the ability to reflect on your own experience as your own. She thinks you need not have the robust first-person perspective in order to be a person. You just have to have a rudimentary first-person perspective and be a member of the right kind to develop something like a robust first-person perspective. It might be that something has gotten in the way. Maybe it's too early, or maybe you've been injured or handicapped, or maybe there are external conditions that are preventing you from reaching that. But as long as you're a member of the right kind that normally develops that, and you have a rudimentary, then you count as a person. So once again, what is a person according to Lynne Rudder? Well, a person is a being with a first-person perspective. And then she distinguishes between rudimentary first-person perspective and robust first-person perspective. And she says that a person is something that has a rudimentary first-person perspective and is of the kind that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. Okay, so then a human person is a being with a rudimentary first-person perspective that is also of a kind that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. And she thinks, right, that a human organism is of the kind that it normally develops a robust first-person perspective. And a human organism that doesn't have robust first-person perspective has been damaged, or is not there yet, or is handicapped, or is prevented from the outside from reaching it. So that's what a person is, and that's what the first-person perspective requirement is for personhood, according to Baker. What about this constitution relation? So we are a person, we're that sort of thing with a first-person perspective, but what is it? What is our relationship to the animal? She says this is what makes us human persons rather than other kinds of persons, is that we bear an intimate relation to human organisms. We are not human organisms, but we are somehow very closely related to them. And the way that she describes it is that we are constituted by human animals or human organism. Well, what does it mean for something to be constituted by something else? Here are the three conditions that she gives for constitution. So in order for X to constitute Y, it must be the case that X is not identical to Y. There really are two objects there, and these two objects may be able to exist apart from one another. Second condition, X and Y share all of their parts. So far we have is a constitution is a relation in which the two things are not identical to one another. Maybe they could come apart, but they do share all of their parts. And condition 3 is that X and Y share many, but not all of their properties. When something is constituted by something else, they're going to share all their parts. And various of their attributes or features or properties are going to be the same, but there's going to be some that the one has that the other does not. Now that's a little bit abstract and a little bit mysterious. Can we get some examples of how this constitution relation is supposed to work? Helpfully she does. In this article and in some of her other works, she gives us some cases of constitution. She thinks this is not unique to human persons. She thinks this constitution relation is all over the place in physical things, right, throughout the world. So maybe the most common example that she gives is the relationship between a statue and a lump of clay. So say that you have a lump of clay and you make it into a particular statue. In other words, right, you sort of give it a particular shape, and so you construct it into, or you mold it into a particular statue. Now, when you made the statue, the lump of clay didn't seem to go away. It didn't seem to cease to exist. And so now we have, looks like the statue and the lump of clay right there. Are there two objects there? In some sense, maybe. It seems like the lump of clay might not have all the same features as a statue does, right? So the statue has various aesthetic qualities. It has, I don't know, monetary value. It began to exist at some time later than the lump of clay did. But it also seems, what's curious about this case is that it looks like the statue and the clay share all of the same parts. It doesn't look like the statue is any bigger than the lump of clay, and the lump of clay isn't any smaller than the statue. It looks like they overlap. It looks like when you pick up the statue, you also pick up the clay. When you drop the statue, you also drop the clay. And so they're in the very same place. They seem to share all of the same physical parts. But yet they still seem to be different. Why did they seem to be different? Well, it seems like the one came into existence later than the other one did. It looks like one has aesthetic qualities that the other lacks. And it looks like one could survive without the other. So if you make the statue, but it's still kind of wet, you can imagine squishing the statue so that the statue is no more, but we still have the lump of clay. So for that reason, it looks like we've got maybe two different things there, the lump of clay and the statue, but they seem to completely overlap with their parts. Lynne Rudder thinks the best way to account for this is the constitution relation. The statue is constituted by the lump of clay. It's not identical to the lump of clay because it existed at a different time. It comes in later. It could cease to exist while the lump of clay continues. So they are distinct objects, but the relationship they bear is that one constitutes the other. The lump of clay constitutes the statue. And Lynne Rudder thinks that this relationship is in artifacts all over the place. So she thinks that you'll have a similar relationship between a flag and the cloth that constitutes it. The cloth seems to be different than the flag. You could rearrange the cloth in such a way such that it doesn't give rise to the flag anymore. Or you think about a dollar bill and the paper that it is constituted by. The fact that it's a dollar, right, seems to depend on some sort of social practices. Those social practices could cease to exist and would no longer be a dollar, but the piece of paper would still be there. So there are reasons to think that we actually have multiple objects there, and yet they seem to share all of the same parts. And so Lynne Rudder thinks that these are some great examples of the constitution relation. And so just like the statue is constituted by the clay, and the flag is constituted by the cloth, and the dollar is constituted by the piece of paper, she wants to say that human persons are constituted by animals. And so you are constituted by a particular human animal. You share all of the same parts, but you are distinct material objects. She thinks that the human animal was around before you came on the scene, and she thinks that you could cease to exist while the human animal continues, much like the lump of clay. Okay, so that gives us both her account of personhood, what makes something a person and what sort of persons we are, but also gives a sense of the human person, right? What it means to be constituted by a human organism such that we get a human person and not just a person of other sorts. She thinks there might be other persons of other varieties, things that have a perverse perspective, but are constituted by different sorts of things. They're not constituted by human animals. Maybe they're constituted by different kinds of animals. Maybe they're constituted by some inorganic material. Maybe they're constituted by some, I don't know, some immaterial stuff. Her account leaves open the possibility that they can be other kinds of persons, and the way that we would distinguish between these persons is not on their abilities, not on their first-person perspective, but on what they're constituted by. Now, she thinks that, okay, so if we are persons, then we do not come into existence until the human organism comes to have a rudimentary first-person perspective. Because remember her conditions for personhood. You have to have a rudimentary first-person perspective, and you have to be of the kind that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. She thinks that human organisms are a kind of thing that normally develops a robust first-person perspective. So when we have something that is constituted by a human organism and has a rudimentary first-person perspective, that's when the human organism constitutes something new, right? When the human organism develops a rudimentary first-person perspective, because it is of the kind that develops a robust, then as soon as it develops the rudimentary first-person perspective, now we have a new thing there. It constitutes this further entity, the human person, which is us. So you don't come on the scene until the human organism develops a rudimentary first-person perspective. The human organism, even though it constitutes you, exists for a while before you're on the scene. It has to meet certain conditions before it constitutes something new, something brand new in the world. So when does that happen? She thinks that the rudimentary first-person perspective is only really there, she thinks, at or shortly before birth. Certainly not early on in pregnancy. Now, we might have all sorts of questions about, well, okay, how do we establish that something has a rudimentary first-person perspective? And does that really happen late in the pregnancy, or does it happen at birth? Does it happen sometimes after? Well, she just wants to say that whenever we can establish a rudimentary first-person perspective, that's when we should think that the human person begins to exist. No earlier, no later. So far we've got that, is what she thinks a human person is. The human person is a being that has a rudimentary first-person perspective, and is of the kind that normally develops a robust first-person perspective, which is constituted by a human animal, in much the same way that a statue is constituted by a lump of clay. And she thinks that the sort of thing that we are, based on that description, doesn't come into existence until the organism develops a rudimentary first-person perspective, which is something like at or shortly before birth. Okay, well, that's when the view would say that we begin to exist, and that's what the view says we are. But why think that that is the right view of what we are? Why think that's the best account of the identity of the human person? Well, the way in which she defends her view of the human person, I think, is a very helpful way to try to defend this view. Is she compares it to the other leading candidates. And here she wants to consider three leading candidates: substance dualism, Olson's animalism, and a view she calls Thomistic animalism, or we might just call it hylomorphism. And she gives reasons for preferring her view to each of those. She doesn't like substance dualism because she thinks that this separates us too much from the physical world. She thinks that once you bring in these immaterial souls, maybe you identify yourself with that immaterial soul. She thinks that that distances you from the natural world too much. It means that sort of Darwinian evolutionary picture of human beings doesn't apply to us in a way at all. So she rejects substance dualism for that reason. In other words, it separates us from the natural world to the extreme, right? To an extreme amount, too much. Now, the reason why she doesn't like animalism is because she doesn't think that it reflects what makes us unique. So on the one hand, substance dualism separates us too far from the natural world. She thinks that animalism doesn't separate us from other creatures well enough. On animalism, what makes you the same over time is roughly the same thing that makes any organism the same over time. You have the same identity conditions. You begin to exist the same time that other creatures do. Lynne Rudder thinks that this doesn't properly capture what's unique about us. It just places us in the larger animal category. So she thinks that our kind and our persistent conditions have to be something unique to us, and that's why she rejects animalism. She rejects Thomistic animalism or hylomorphism for a similar reason for why she rejects substance dualism. She thinks that this, too, actually makes us too unique as compared to other creatures, that we have these souls that can exist after the death of the bodies, which other creatures do not have. She thinks distances us too much from the natural world. Summarizing her complaints about the other views, on page 43, she has this to say. She says, biological animalism does not recognize the ontological importance of the unique properties of human persons. Thomistic animalism, while recognizing the ontological importance of human persons, attributes the ontologically important properties to putatively immaterial features of members of the animal kingdom. By contrast, the Constitution view both recognizes the ontological importance of the unique properties of human persons and regards human persons as natural material beings, without contravening any tenets of traditional theism or even of Christian doctrine. So one of the things that she's highlighting here is that Lynne Rudder is, or was, she passed away a few years ago, is a practicing Christian. And so she's interested in preserving our uniqueness, partly for theological reasons. But she thinks that substance dualism and hylomorphism make us too unique. They separate us from the natural world too much. And animalism doesn't respect what makes us unique. And so therefore, she thinks that her view is the best. She thinks that it gets us very intimately related to the animal, but it also distinguishes us from the animal and so distinguishes us from other creatures. She thinks that hers hits the sweet spot. I'm not entirely sure she's right about that, but I like her strategy. It's similar to the way that I described hylomorphism as properly capturing these two aspects. It captures both our vulnerability and our dignity. In a way, she's trying to capture both of those elements, and she thinks that the Constitution view captures those two elements best out of any of the other views. So I like her strategy. I'm not sure that I buy her critiques of the other views. She doesn't bring in, notice, right, any of the other technical puzzles about personal identity that we've been considering in this class. She just reflects on sort of the desired features of a theory of the human person and says the Constitution view is the only one that has all of those desired features. Okay, so now we've gone through 3 steps of her argument. We've established what she thinks we are, what a human person is. She's established when she thinks that sort of thing that we are begins to exist, and she's argued in favor of that theory of the human person, arguing that the other views are less preferable to this one. Now, the last stage of her argument is when she's going to apply her theory of the human person, and when it says that we come to exist, to the ethical issue of abortion. Importantly, what she's going to say is that it is false that you were once a fetus. So any argument that uses or relies on a premise that says that that which is in the womb is the same kind of thing that we are, she thinks has to fail, because that crucial premise is false on her view, which she's argued is superior to the other views. And so she thinks if the sort of thing in the womb is not the same kind of thing as us, then other concerns might outweigh any of the concerns of that fetus, because it isn't the same kind of thing as us, right? If there are any concerns dealing with us, those would outweigh any of the concerns of that which is in the womb. Now, importantly, she thinks that the identity premise is super crucial to this argument. She thinks that if you could establish that the fetus were a human person, that it were one of us, she thinks that that would settle the debate. She thinks that the moral premise from there would be a slam dunk. She thinks that once you establish the identity premise, right, she thinks that that is going to settle the issue. So, for example, on page 44, she says, if the fetus is a person, abortion is morally permissible regardless of the circumstances of the pregnant girl or woman. Later on 46, she says that if O were false, if abortion were morally impermissible on the grounds that a fetus is a person, then morally speaking, there could be no exceptions to the prohibition of abortion in the case of anencephaly, or in the case of rape or incest, or in the case of saving the pregnant woman's life. None of these considerations would be relevant to allowing abortion. And then lastly, she gives a statement of this. on the very last page of her article on page 48, she says, if abortion were the killing of an innocent person, then none of the considerations that I mentioned, anencephaly, rape, incest, the pregnant person's suitability for parenthood, or the others, would even be relevant to the morality of abortion. There would be nothing to argue about. So clearly she thinks the crucial premise is the identity, the metaphysical premise, establishing that the fetus is one of us, is it the same sort of thing as us. She thinks that if you could establish that premise, slam dunk, abortion becomes impermissible. All the other issues that you could raise are irrelevant. But she thinks importantly that that premise is not true. She thinks that you were never a fetus, that the fetus is not the same sort of thing that we are. And so that's the way she's applying her theory of the human person to the issue of abortion. She's arguing that it is permissible because the fetus is not the same sort of thing as us, and so does not have the same sort of moral value. Now, I think if you wanted to disagree with Baker on this, if you wanted to deny her conclusion that abortion is morally permissible because of the reason that we were never fetuses, how would you go against that? How would you try to argue against her view? I think that you'd have to argue not at the level of ethics, right? You don't get to argue that, well, her conclusion is morally reprehensible, so therefore, right, we can deny her metaphysics. I think you have to argue the other way around. If you want to get around her ethical conclusion that abortion is morally permissible, you have to go into her metaphysical account of the human person, and you have to give reasons to doubt that that is the correct account of the human person. So we've seen the details about her account of the human person, about what she thinks a person is most generally, and what she thinks it is for something to be a human person, this constitution relation. Well, what I think we should do is we should brainstorm possible objections to her theory. Because if you can come up with reasons to think that her theory of the human person isn't the right one, then that undermines her argument in favor for the moral permissibility of abortion. Because if her view is shown to be false, right, then she loses her objection to the main argument. So are there any good reasons to think that her view of the human person doesn't work? Well, notice that it is a version of the psychological approach. I said that we've seen 3 versions of the psychological approach already: memory theory, bundle theory, and the thinking parts view. The constitution view is one of the big 4 versions of the psychological approach. We didn't talk about it earlier because I knew we were going to address this when we read the Lynne Rudder Baker article later on. But hers is different from those other views, but it is importantly a psychological account. She thinks that we are essentially self-conscious beings, and that we persist by means of some kind of psychological continuity, and that we are importantly distinct from the animal in our chair. So maybe we can bring in various objections we already have to psychological approaches to the human person. So for example, maybe we can bring in Eric Olson's thinking animal argument. Maybe a worry for Baker's account is, wait a second, if you're distinguishing between the person and the animal, and they share all the same parts, it means they both have brains. And if they both have brains, then isn't it the case that both of them are thinking? Aren't there too many thinkers here, both the person and the animal? And we saw that Olson wants to say that once you bring in too many thinkers, you've got all these other difficulties. You've got epistemic concerns, you've got overpopulation concerns, you've got personhood concerns. Baker doesn't think, or she thinks that her view can get around this too many thinkers worry. She distinguishes between being a thinker in a primary sense, or in the strict sense, and being a thinker in the derivative sense. And so she thinks the person is the primary thinker. The animal does think in a sense, but only in a derivative sense, in the derivative sense of constituting something which thinks in the strict sense. Now, her and Olson went back for many, many years about whether this derivative and primary thinker distinction really gets around the problem of too many thinkers. Whether they're primary or derivative, it's still going to follow that we have more than one thinking your thoughts. And isn't that bad enough? If you're interested in this puzzle, as I said, they went back and forth on this for several years on whether she can actually get around this puzzle. There's a really interesting back and forth that goes on in the literature between them. Another worry we might have about her account, which she doesn't actually spell out in full detail in this article, and to my knowledge doesn't spell out in full detail in any of her other books or articles as well, is she wants to say that some things that the person does in the strict primary sense and the animal only does in the derivative sense. But some things the animal does in the strict and primary sense, and the person only does in the derivative sense. So, for example, I think she'd want to say that the person sees or hears, has senses in the derivative sense of being constituted by the animal that does in the straightforward sense. She thinks that what the person does in the primary sense are these things like thinking and other conscious activities. The animal only does these in the derivative sense. But I need a much clearer account of what the job specialization is. Because we might not get not only too many thinkers, but anything that the animal does, isn't there also a sense in which the person does? And anything the person does, isn't there also a sense in which the animal does? I need a clearer account of how the job specialization is supposed to go. Because if you're on the person side, whatever you put on the animal side, that means that you don't strictly and primarily do any of those things. And so it might violate St. Thomas's idea that no, you are both the thinker and the perceiver. It looks like on Baker's view, she might have to say that you are the thinker, you're only indirectly the perceiver, and that might be a problem for her view. The other main worry I have about Lynne Rudder Baker's view is this whole constitution relation. So it seems intuitive. Maybe we think that it's a nice account for handling the statue in the clay, or the flag on the cloth, or the dollar bill and the paper. But I have a lot of serious questions about this constitution relation. In some ways, it seems arbitrary to me. When does constitution occur? When does the possession of a new capacity give rise to a new thing, and when does it not? So the idea is not just that the human organism comes to have a new property, and so we can regard it as a new kind of thing. She says, no. When the human organism develops rudimentary first-person perspective, some new entity begins to exist. There is some new thing in the world. And so this is pretty significant. This is not just it has a new and interesting feature. It's not just like it passed its driver's test. No. There's a new thing in the world when that capacity develops. And so my thought is, well, what's so special about that capacity? When do things come into existence out of their constitution base, and when do they not? So, for example, when the human organism develops the ability to sense, either see or to hear, how come that isn't significant enough? Why don't we get, right, it's the person, right? Why don't we get the sensor, right? The perceiver, right? As a new thing in the world once the organism has the ability to engage in sense perception. Or maybe your capacity to feel pleasure and pain, right? So we get the feeler, right? Why doesn't a new thing called the feeler come into existence? Or, right, why isn't a new entity there when the organism develops the robust first-person perspective? She thinks that's an important kind of first-person perspective. So why isn't there a new thing on the scene when that happens? So I have a bunch of worries about the seeming arbitrariness of when constitution occurs and when it doesn't. So put those three together, my main concerns about her theory of the human person is that it's not clear that she gets around the problem of too many thinkers. There's also a worry about you, the person, only indirectly doing a lot of the things that we might want to say that you directly do. And there's also the worry that the constitution relation seems kind of arbitrary. It's not clear when it occurs and what differences in capacities or abilities give rise to new things and which ones don't. And if any of these concerns, right, we could work on them. They're just sort of spelled out roughly here. If we could really sort of drill these home, maybe they could raise some real serious worries for her account. Maybe they would show, or even if they're not knockdown arguments, if any view doesn't have those sorts of concerns and does better against its own concerns, maybe we should prefer the other view to hers. And if that other view says that we begin to exist much earlier than she does, then maybe we've got a nice counter argument to her argument for the moral permissibility of abortion based on the identity of the human person.